Hi everyone. We discussed the basic concepts of water governance, what are the basic elements in water governance, what are the major principles that need to be considered while framing the policies and governance practices for water in previous week. This week we are specifically going to talk about water governance in India. So, earlier we had a general perspective, the basic philosophies, basic principles, elements, good governance practices, benchmarking, this is what we discussed in an earlier week. But this week we will be limited to our own nation, we will be talking about what are the major issues, concerns, practices, lapses in water governance sector in India. So, we are going to start with historical perspective of water governance in India. Okay. Now, the management of water sector in India, if we talk about, so not only in India, but even in the other Asian countries also, if we see these are a few remarks by prominent personalities. So, Professor Asit Viswas, who is a Stockholm Water Prize winner, wrote in Asian Water Development Outlook 2007 that if some Asian countries face a water crisis in future, it will not be because of physical scarcity of water, but because of inadequate or inappropriate water governance, including management practices, institutional arrangement and socio-political conditions which leave much to be desired. Okay. Similar opinion was coined by Tadao Chino, who is former president of Asian Development Bank. So, he said that water crisis in Asia region is essentially a crisis of water governance. Okay. Professor Gallic PH of Pacific Institute also had similar opinion when said that India's water problem are not those of scarcity, but rather of inefficient use and bureaucratic policies. So, basically the idea of putting this statement is to make you aware that the major expert's opinion in the sector is more concerned on the governance of water rather than just availability of water or practices or engineering aspect of the water. So, governance of water is one of the very prime challenges in the India and in fact in the entire Asia that way. So, let us see how basically water was being managed in ancient India and what kind of development have taken place, we have moved to what state from which state. So, the water management is basically as old as the start of civilization. Okay. During the ages of Manu, in the laws of Manu, basically there are indications are provided on the water law of that time. Okay. So, water which was considered indivisible during that period, they had considered like water bodies as boundaries between villages and ensure that as many villages as possible had access to the water, and specific diversion or obstruction of water was discouraged even during those phases. Okay. It was the responsibility of king to protect public waters and collect fee for crossing water. So, fee was not there for using water, but for crossing water, crossing river and for this kind of movements there was fee even in that ages or taxes what we can call. Okay. Then however, water bodies of enemies could be destroyed in time of war. So, during the war, because during war times people wanted or the king wanted to have capture of the territory, capture of the region, and make the enemy forces weaker, and destroying the water resources or destroying the water bodies of enemies is one of the prime ways, is one of the ways to make the enemies sort of, because when their basic amenities, when their requirement of water, when their requirement of food is not being fulfilled, how they are going to fight for. So, that is why these water bodies were target during the wars. More elaborative description of the water management from the ancient India is available for the Kautilian period. So, the Kautilya, who basically framed the Arthashastra, so he has provided a detailed account of governance, particularly about the water also, including all other aspects. So, the Arthashastra discuss the uses of water for the development of water works, irrigation, transport, and overall sort of all other needs. Okay. And users were pay a water tax to withdraw water from irrigation system installed by the ruler. So, that was the framework. So, there was basically taxes or charges for irrigation water back in that period. Okay. There were far more elaborative discussion onto the system of taxes. Okay. So, when let us say a new tank or embankment is being done, or renovation of some existing water bodies, or this thing is being taken up during the Kautilian period. So, there was because it was considered beneficial for society, so there was exemption of taxes for a specific period of time. It could be 4 year, 3 year, 5 year. So, there was some time frame, some time period for which there was tax exemption. So, this like in these today's age we get such things for industrial zones. Okay. We several state governments, in order to promote the industries to come there and open new companies, new factories, new setups. So, they encourage like the rebate in the terms of taxes, state taxes. Okay. So, that was there also in back in Kautilian period, there was rebate in the taxes on water as well for maintenance of water works. There were limited provisions for private ownership. Okay. And however, embankment and tanks which were owned by someone, okay, they had right to sell or mortgage these water bodies as well. Whereas, such tanks were not in use for a period of 5 years, ownership rights was used to be lapsed, and it comes under the purview of the king or the ruler back at that time. Further, the Arthashastra says that all those who leased, hired or shared water body has a responsibility to maintain them. The private owners are allowed to give water to other parties through irrigation works in exchange of various products or produces. The taxes that were owed to the king were specified in much more detail, in great depth in the Arthashastra, and these taxes were usually collected by the chief superintendent of the crown land. Okay. It further says that irrigating one's own field, no harm is to be sort of created to the others. Okay. If prohibited or for those who are defaulting on these laws, particularly on the laws of water, okay, basically like prohibited release of water from dam without a legitimate reason, or obstruction of the legitimate use of water by others. So, all those water related issues has sort of specified punishment as well, okay. And these punishments could be very very severe punishments at time. Okay. The Arthashastra says that has a list of damage types and corresponding compensation or penalty due, and this penalty due was up to death penalty. So, death by drowning, that means basically they used to dip those defaulters, the extreme level defaulters in water bodies itself to ensure their death by drowning. Okay. The water routes could be used for the purpose of transport and trade, and the principles of sort of good neighborliness was a civic duty. So, would be coming under the civic sense. Further, the Arthashastra elaborates in great detail the foreign policy, but does not say much explicitly about the water. However, there was room available for developing treaties for joint water works along with the foreign nations. Post this, when India moved under the Mughal age, so the Islamic laws were introduced, especially particularly in the northern part of India, okay, and this Islamic law principles included, sort of said that water is a gift of God and no individual or no ruler or king can own water, and therefore, everybody should have access to the water. In Muslim rule particularly, there was not much attention was paid onto the water, which could be two reasons. Okay. One could be the possibility of that there are relatively high availability of water was there in India at that time. So, there was enough of resources, less population. So, there was no issue of less water availability or scarcity. So, there was not much conflicts that way, okay, with the Islamic norms, and people were used to basically people were authorized to use water in whichever way they desire. Okay. So, the Islamic followers used to consume water by their belief, and non-believers were also allowed to follow their own systems or their own practices, because there was not much of dispute or conflicts. Okay. However, it could be basically presented in another form as well, that it also indicates that there was relative lack of attention towards water regulation during that Islamic period. Now, if you see specific practices of water management, okay, it was particularly in the ancient India, there was it becomes very apparent that the knowledge of hydrology and water resource engineering was used to a great detail. So, that is supposedly deeply rooted in the Indian culture, Indian ancient culture, and by following the science of ancient India, if you just look some of these structures related to the water, one can say that how nicely the principle or the concepts of hydrology, hydraulics and water resources engineering, or even the quality protection has been used in the construction, design, maintenance of those structures. Okay. So, our ancestors using this knowledge designed and constructed dams, variety of water structures much earlier than sort of generally believed that Greek, Roman or other ancient civilization has taken up this initiation. Okay. Every region in our country has its own water harvesting technique, which reflects the geographical peculiarities and cultural uniqueness. What is the culture, what is the tradition, what is the practices. So, according to that, we like different parts of India has its own different cultures. Okay. Water management structure, let us say in the hills of Garhwal or Himachal, would surely be different than that in the plains of northern or central part. Okay. Southern practices are different. So, they will likely to have sort of their own culture, tradition, and that way the water management structures are also very specific to the regions, many of them in fact. These are some of the examples of our ancient water engineering. Okay. So, what is apparent on screen is actually the is typically called jhalars, which is a sort of rectangular shaped step wells which can be seen from here. Okay. It can be seen in this way that there are the different step wells, one over the other in the rectangular shape. There is passage through the steps. So, these were built to ensure the easy and regular supply of water for religious rites, okay, royal ceremonies, and even community use at the time of scarcity or at the time of drought. The city of Jodhpur has 8 such jhalars, the oldest being in the Mahamandir Jhalar, that is dated back in 1660. Okay. So, that is one of the type of structure. Okay. There are talabs, or also known as bandi, which are the basic reservoirs that store water for household consumption and drinking purpose. Okay. So, it would be a simple structure like this. It could be natural, okay, which is also known as pokhari or pokhariya pond at local level in different places. Okay. So, those type of, like there are pokhariya ponds in Tikamgarh, or it could be man made like the lakes, various lakes in Udaipur. Okay. A reservoir with an area less than 5 bigha is called talai, a medium sized lake is called bandi, and bigger lakes are called sagar or samand, which is derived from the samudra or sagar, that way. So, these are there are bevari, which is type of step wells used in the part of the ancient network of water storage in the cities of Rajasthan again. So, you see that Rajasthan from the beginning has been very like the resource availability was less. So, this type of structure has taken up development of these structure has taken up on a larger scale, on a great scale, because when there is a need, there is a requirement. So, people will find the way to store, harvest, or design the structures to for storing water, so that it can be used at the time of need. So, the little rain in the region is received will be diverted through various man made tanks through these canals built on the hilly outskirt of the cities. Okay. The water would then percolate into the ground, raising the water table and recharging a deep and intricate network of aquifer. So, this was an artificial kind of recharge facilities as well, not that it was being pumped, but through harvested water was stored over a place from where the groundwater recharge could take place. It was not limited to groundwater recharge only, of course, it was the surface water was also available for uses. Okay. There are khuls which are there in the Himachal Pradesh. Okay. So, because of the specific terrain, specific structures over there, so surface water channels are there in the mountainous regions of Himachal Pradesh. Okay. So, these are known as khuls. These channels carry glacier water from river and streams into the field. Okay. The Kangra Valley system has an estimated around over 700 major khuls and around 2500 minor khuls that irrigate more than 30,000 hectares in the valley. So, this was mostly for the irrigation purpose. Okay. This could be built either through public donations or by the rulers back then. Then there are tankas, which is again a traditional rainwater harvesting technique. Okay. This is indigenous to Thar desert. So, in Thar desert area they use such systems a lot. There are still several such systems. So, this Taka is actually a cylindrical paved underground pit, as is apparent from the figure over here. Okay. So, it is from this underground pit is there, and the water which received elsewhere is put through from the like rooftop, courtyard or artificially prepared catchment flows, and that is sort of put into the pit through proper system, and once it is completely filled, the water is stored in a Taka, can last throughout the dry season in, and typically one Taka, the size of one Taka is such that it will be sufficient for a family of 5 to 6 members for the entire summer season. There are some more examples, such examples, many of them exist that way. There are ahar pines in Bihar, which is again a channel like this, you can see over here, this one. So, simple channel again for irrigation purpose. Okay. There are johats which are there in Karnataka and Odisha, which are similar to lake or pond kind of structure for storing water. Okay. Then there are pad systems which are used in a few regions in Madhya Pradesh. Okay. So, for like putting stone based retaining walls or barrages for the storing water and then channelizing it through a fine section in a controlled manner. Okay. Then there are zing which are there in the Ladakh area. So, there the water is particularly the ice or this thing glaciers or the freezed water is stored over there, and as the ice melts and these things, so the water becomes available for the uses. Then there are Bhandara part in which are small kind of not exactly dam, small kind of barrage for retaining water, and whenever there is a need, it can be the gates can be opened and it can be circulated for irrigation purpose in the channels. Okay. There are Zabu in Nagaland for again irrigation purpose, agricultural fields are used as a to harvest rainwater systems. So, that way there are various specific structures in the specific regions of India, in the different parts, different sections of India, these kind of structures are there. It is not only limited to the one that we just see, there are many such again many such structures are available, locally made, locally designed, and that can be eventually used for the purpose of irrigation, for the purpose of fulfilling domestic need, for the purpose of rainwater harvesting, for the purpose of groundwater recharge. So, you see the kind of objectives that are being fulfilled by these small scale attempts, okay, at a village level, at a small level or a community level or a city level. So, with these kind of even small attempts, these structures are found to satisfy the purpose, the basic purpose of their own building or constructions. Okay. It is not only limited to just recognition in the engineering or these aspects. There are international recognition has been received for some of these structures. Okay. One such structure that you see here is actually Rani Ki Vav, which is a 11th century step well situated in Gujarat, okay, and it was internationally recognized as a World Heritage Site in 2014. So, it was basically acknowledged as an exceptional example of technological development, okay, that too in the ancient ages, okay, which utilizes groundwater resources and a unique water management system which illustrates the exceptional capacity to break large space into various smaller volumes following ideal aesthetic proportions. So, it is aesthetically very good, as well as it satisfy its purpose for the overall water resources management, okay, where in the because it's a structure such that it can tap the groundwater like any well, dug well kind of system. So, it can trap groundwater, it can basically retain the rainwater for over a large period of time. So, the flow of the groundwater is in both ways, okay. It can be at the times of rainfall or high rain events, it can be utilized as a recharge structure, or at times of drought it can be utilized as a resource from which the groundwater can be withdrawn. So, these are some of the examples for the water structure and water engineering from the ancient periods. So, we will end this session here, and in next session we are going to talk the further water governance and management practices, some of the water governance and management practices in the India just pre and post independence. Thank you.